Marcellus. They say that Marcus Claudius, who was 5 times consul of the Romans, was the son of Marcus, and that he was the first of his family called Marcellus, that is, Martial, as Posidonius affirms. He was indeed by long experience skilful in the art of war, of a strong body, valiant of hand, and by natural inclinations addicted to war. This high temper and heat he showed conspicuously in battle. In other respects he was modest and obliging, and so far studious of Greek learning and discipline as to honor and admire those that excelled in it, and though he did not himself attain a proficiency in them equal to his desire, by reason of his employments. For if ever there were any men whom, as Homer says, heaven, from their first youth unto their utmost age, appointed the laborious wars to wage, certainly they were the chief Romans of that time, who in their youth had war with the Carthaginians in Sicily, in their middle age with the Gauls in the defense of Italy itself, and at last, when grown old, struggled again with Hannibal and the Carthaginians, and wanted in their latest years what is granted to most men, exemption from military toils, their rank and their great qualities still making them be called upon to undertake the command. Marcellus, ignorant or unskilful of no kind of fighting, in single combat surpassed himself. He never declined a challenge, and never accepted without killing his challenger. In Sicily, he protected and saved his brother Autochilius, when surrounded in battle, and slew the enemies that pressed upon him, for which act he was by the generals, while he was yet but young, presented with crowns and other honorable rewards, and, his good qualities more and more displaying themselves, he was created curule dile, by the people and by the high priest augur, which is that priesthood to which chiefly the law assigns the observation of auguries. In his aedileship, a certain mischance brought him to the necessity of bringing an impeachment into the Senate. He had a son named Marcus, of great beauty, in the flower of his age and no less admired for the goodness of his character. This youth, Capitolinus, a bold and ill-mannered man, Marcellus's colleague, sought to abuse. The boy at first himself repelled him, but when the other again persecuted him, told his father. Marcellus, highly indignant, accused the man in the Senate, where he, having appealed to the tribunes of the people, endeavored by various shifts and exceptions to elude the impeachment. And, when the tribunes refused their protection, by flat denial rejected the charge. As there was no witness of the fact, the Senate thought fit to call the youth himself before them. On witnessing whose blushes and tears, and shame mixed with the highest indignation, seeking no further evidence of the crime, they condemned Capitolinus, and set a fine upon him, of the money of which Marcellus caused silver vessels for libation to be made, which he dedicated to the gods. After the end of the first Punic War, which lasted 21 years, the seed of Gallic tumult sprang up, and began again to trouble Rome. The Insubrians, a people inhabiting the subalpine region of Italy, strong in their own forces, raised from among the other Gauls aid of mercenary soldiers called Gestae. And it was a sort of miracle, and special good fortune for Rome, that the Gallic war was not coincident with the Punic, but that the Gauls had with fidelity stood quiet as spectators, while the Punic war continued, as though they had been under engagement to await and attack the victors, and now only were at liberty to come forward. Still, the position itself, and the ancient renown of the Gauls, struck no little fear into the minds of the Romans, who were about to undertake a war so near home and upon their own borders, and regarded the Gauls, because they had once taken their city, with more apprehension than any people, as is apparent from the enactment which from the time forth provided, that the high priest should enjoy an exemption from all military duty, except only in Gallic insurrections. The great preparations, also, made by the Romans for war, for it is not reported that the people of Rome ever had at one time so many legions in arms either before or since, and their extraordinary sacrifices were plain arguments of their fear. For though they were most averse to barbarous and cruel rites, and entertained more than any nation the same pious and reverent sentiments of the gods of the Greeks, yet, when this war was coming upon them, they then, from some prophecies in the Sibyl's books, put alive underground a pair of Greeks, one male, the other female, and likewise 2 Gauls, one of each sex, in the market called the Beast Market, continuing even to this day to offer to these Greeks and Gauls certain ceremonial observances in the month of November. In the beginning of this war, in which the Romans sometimes obtained remarkable victories, sometimes were shamefully beaten, nothing was done toward the determination of the contest until Flaminius and Furius, being consuls, led large forces against the Insubrians. At the time of their departure, the river that runs through the country of Picenium was seen flowing with blood. There was a report that 3 moons had once been seen at Ariminum, and, in the consular assembly, the augurs declared that the consuls had been unduly and inauspiciously created. The Senate, therefore, immediately sent letters to the camp, recalling the consuls to Rome with all possible speed, and commanding them to forbear from acting against the enemies, and to abdicate the consulship on the first opportunity. This happened at a later period. About the same time, too, the priesthood was taken away from 2 men of very great honor, Cornelius Cethegus and Quintus Sulpicius. From the former, because he had not rightly held out the entrails of a beast slain for sacrifice. From the latter, because while he was immolating, the tufted cap which the Flamins wear had fallen from his head. Minucius, the dictator, who had already named Caius Flaminius master of the horse, they deposed from his command, because the squeak of a mouse was heard, and put others into their places. And yet, notwithstanding by observing so anxiously these little niceties, they did not run into any superstition, because they never varied from nor exceeded the observances of their ancestors. So soon as Flaminius with his colleague had resigned the consulate, Marcellus was declared consul by the presiding officers called interexes. These letters being brought to Flaminius, he deferred to open them till, having defeated and put to flight the enemy's forces, he wasted and ravaged their borders. The people, therefore, did not go forth to meet him when he returned with huge spoils. Nay, because he had not instantly obeyed the command in the letters, by which he was recalled, but slighted and contemned them, and they were very near denying him the honor of a triumph. Nor was the triumph sooner past than they deposed him, with his colleague, from the magistracy, and reduced them to the state of private citizens. So much were all things at Rome made to depend upon religion. They would not allow any contempt of the omens and the ancient rites, even though attended with the highest success, thinking it to be of more importance to the public safety that the magistrates should reverence the gods, than that they should overcome their enemies. Thus Tiberius Sempronius, whom for his probity and virtue the citizens highly esteemed, created Scipio Nasica and Caius Marcius consuls to succeed him, and when they were gone into their provinces, lit upon books concerning the religious observances, where he found something he had not known before, which was this. When the consul took his auspices, he sat without the city in a house or tent hired for that occasion. But, if it happened that he, for any urgent cause, returned into the city, without having yet seen any certain signs, he was obliged to leave that first building or tent, and to seek another to repeat the survey from. Tiberius, it appears, in ignorance of this, had twice used the same building before announcing the new consuls. Now, understanding his error, he referred the matter to the Senate. Nor did the Senate neglect this minute fault, but soon wrote expressly of it to Scipio Nasica and Caius Marcius, who, leaving their provinces and without delay returning to Rome, laid down their magistracy. And, entering into the magistracy, chose Gnaeus Cornelius his colleague. There was a report that, the Gauls proposing a pacification, and the Senate also inclining to peace, Marcellus inflamed the people to war, but a peace appears to have been agreed upon, which the Gaecitae broke, who passing the Alps, stirred up the Insubrians, they being 30,000 in number, and the Insubrians more numerous by far, and proud of their strength, marched directly to Acarae, a city seated on the north of the river Po. From thence Britomartus, king of Gaecitae, taking with him 10,000 soldiers, harassed the country round about. News of which being brought to Marcellus, leaving his colleague at Acarae, with the foot and all the heavy arms and a third part of the horse, and carrying with him the rest of the horse and 600 light-armed foot, marching night and day without remission, he stayed not till he came up to these 10,000 near a Gaulish village called Clastidium, which not long before had been reduced under the Roman jurisdiction. Nor had he time to refresh his soldiers or to give them rest, for the barbarians, that were then present, immediately observed his approach and contemned him, because he had very few foot with him. The Gauls were singularly skilful in horsemanship, and thought to excel in it, and as at present they also exceeded Marcellus in number, they made no account of him. They, therefore, with their king at their head, instantly charged upon him, as if they would trample him under their horses' feet, threatening all kinds of cruelties. Marcellus, because his men were few, that they might not be encompassed and charged on all sides by the enemy, extended his wings of horse, and, riding about, drew out his wings of foot in length, till he came near to the enemy. Just as he was in the act of turning round to face the enemy, it so happened that his horse, startled with their fierce look and their cries, gave back, and carried him forcibly aside. Fearing lest this accident, if converted into an omen, might discourage his soldiers, he quickly brought his horse round to confront the enemy, and made a gesture of adoration to the sun, as if he had wheeled about not by chance but for a purpose of devotion. For it was customary to the Romans, when they offered worship to the gods, to turn around, and in this moment of meeting the enemy, he is said to have vowed the best of the arms to Jupiter for Atreus. The king of the Gauls beholding Marcellus, and from the badges of his authority conjecturing him to be the general, advanced some way before his embattled army, and with a loud voice challenged him, and, brandishing his lance, fiercely ran in full career at him, exceeding the rest of the Gauls in stature, and with his armor that was adorned with gold and silver in various colors, shining like lightning. These arms seeming to Marcellus, while he viewed the enemy's army drawn up in battalia, to be the best and fairest, and thinking them to be those he had vowed to Jupiter, he instantly ran upon the king, and pierced through his breastplate with his lance, then pressing upon him with the weight of his horse, threw him to the ground, and with 2 or 3 strokes more slew him. Immediately he leapt from his horse, laid his hand upon the dead king's arm, and, looking up towards heaven, thus spoke: "O Jupiter Feretrius, arbiter of the exploits of captains, and of the acts of commanders in war and battles, be thou witness that I, a general, have slain a general. I, a consul, have slain a king with my own hand, third of all the Romans, and that to thee I consecrate these first and most excellent of the spoils. Grant to us to dispatch the relics of the war of the same course of fortune." Then the Roman horse, joining battle not only with the enemy's horse, but also with the foot who attacked them, obtained a singular and unheard-of victory. For never before or since have so few horse defeated such numerous forces of horse and foot together, the enemies being to a great number slain, and the spoils collected. He returned to his colleague, who was conducting the war with ill success against the enemies near the greatest and most populous of the Gallic cities, Milan. This was their capital, and, therefore, fighting valiantly in defense of it, they were not so much besieged by Cornelius as they besieged him. But Marcellus having returned, and the Gaesitae retiring as soon as they were certified of the death of the king and the defeat of his army, Milan was taken. The rest of their towns and all they had, the Gauls delivered up of their own accord to the Romans, and had peace upon equitable conditions granted to them. Marcellus alone, by decree of the Senate, triumphed. The triumph was in magnificence, opulent spoils, and the gigantic bodies of the captives most remarkable. But the most grateful and most rare spectacle of all was the general himself, carrying the arms of the barbarian king to the god to whom he had vowed them. He had taken a tall and straight stalk of an oak, and had lopped off and formed it to a trophy. Upon this he fastened and hung about the arms of the king, arranging all the pieces in their suitable places. The procession advancing solemnly, he, carrying this trophy, ascended the chariot, and thus himself the fairest and most glorious triumphant image was conveyed into the city. The army adorned with shining armor followed in order, and with verses composed for the occasion, and with songs of victory celebrated the praises of Jupiter and of their general. Then entering the temple of Jupiter Feretrius, he dedicated his gift, the third, and to our memory the last that ever did so. The first was Romulus, after having slain Acron, king of the Cainenses. The second, Cornelius Cossas, who slew Tolumnius the Etruscan. After them Marcellus, having killed Britomartus, king of the Gauls. After Marcellus, no man. The god to whom these spoils were consecrated is called Jupiter Feretrius, from the trophy carried on the Feretrum, one of the Greek words which at that time still existed in great numbers in Latin. Or, as others say, it is the surname of the thundering Jupiter derived from ferire, to strike. Others there are who would have the name to be deduced from the strokes that are given in fight, since even now in battles, when they press upon their enemies, they constantly call out to each other, "Strike!" in Latin, ferri. Spoils in general they call spolia, and these in particular opima. Though, indeed, they say that Numa Pompilius, in his commentaries, makes mention of first, second, and third spolia opima, and that he prescribes that the first be consecrated to Jupiter Feretrius, the second to Mars, the third to Quirinus, as also that the reward of the first be 300 asses, of the second 200, of the third 100. The general account, however, prevails that those spoils only are opima, which the general first takes in said battle, and takes from the enemy's chief captain, whom he has slain with his own hand. But of this enough. The victory and the ending of the war was so welcome to the people of Rome, that they sent to Apollo of Delphi, in testimony of their gratitude, a present of a golden cup of 100 pound weight, and gave a great part of the spoil to their associate cities, and took care that many presents should be sent also to Hiero, king of the Syracusans, their friend and ally. When Hannibal invaded Italy, Marcellus was dispatched with a fleet to Sicily. And when the army had been defeated at Cannae, and many thousands of them perished, and a few had saved themselves by flying to Canusium, and all feared lest Hannibal, who had destroyed the strength of the Roman army, should advance at once with his victorious troops to Rome, Marcellus first sent for the protection of the city 1,500 soldiers from the fleet. Then, by decree of the Senate going to Canusium, having heard that many of the soldiers had come together in that place, he led them out of the fortifications to prevent the enemy from ravaging the country. The chief Roman commanders had most of them fallen in battles, and the citizens complained that the extreme caution of Fabius Maximus, whose integrity and wisdom gave him the highest authority, verged upon timidity and inaction. They confided in him to keep them out of danger, but could not expect that he would enable them to retaliate. Fixing, therefore, their thoughts upon Marcellus, and hoping to combine his boldness, confidence, and promptitude with Fabius's caution and prudence, and to temper the one by the other, they sent, sometimes both with consular command, sometimes one as consul, the other as proconsul, against the enemy. Posidonius writes that Fabius was called the buckler, Marcellus the sword of Rome. Certainly, Hannibal himself confessed that he feared Fabius as a schoolmaster, Marcellus as an adversary. The former, lest he should be hindered from doing mischief, the latter, lest he should receive harm himself. And first, when among Hannibal's soldiers, proud of their victory, carelessness and boldness had grown to a great height, Marcellus attacking all their stragglers and plundering parties, cut them off, and by little and little diminished their forces. Then carrying aid to the Neapolitans and Nolans, he confirmed the minds of the former, who indeed were of their own accord faithful enough to the Romans, but in Nola he found a state of discord. The Senate not being able to rule and keep in the common people, who were generally favorers of Hannibal. There was in the town one Bantius, a man renowned for his high birth and courage. This man, after he had fought most fiercely at Cannae, and had killed many of the enemies, at last was found lying in a heap of dead bodies, covered with darts, and was brought to Hannibal, who so honored him, that he not only dismissed him without ransom, but also contracted friendship with him, and made him his guest. In gratitude for this great favor, he became one of the strongest partisans of Hannibal, and urged the people to revolt. Marcellus could not be induced to put to death a man of such eminence, and who had endured such dangers in fighting on the Roman side. But, knowing himself able, by the general kindliness of his disposition, and in particular by the attractiveness of his address, to gain over a character whose passion was for honor, one day when Bantius saluted him, he asked him who he was, not that he knew him not before, but seeking an occasion of further conference. When Bantius had told who he was, Marcellus, seeming surprised with joy and wonder, replied, "Are you that Bantius whom the Romans commend above the rest that fought at Cannae, and praise as the one man that not only did not forsake the consul Paulus Emilius, but received in his own body many darts thrown at him?" Bantius owning himself to be that very man, and showing the scars. "Why then," said Marcellus, "did not you, having such proofs to show of your affection to us, come to me at my first arrival here? Do you think that we are unwilling to requite with favor those who have well deserved, and who are honored even by our enemies?" He followed up his courtesies by a present of a war-horse, and 500 drachmas in money. From that time Bantius became the most faithful assistant and ally of Marcellus, and a most keen discoverer of those that attempted innovation and sedition. These were many, and had entered into a conspiracy to plunder the baggage of the Romans, when they should make an eruption against the enemy. Marcellus therefore, having marshalled his army within the city, placed the baggage near to the gates, and by an edict forbade the Nolans to go to the walls. Thus outside the city no arms could be seen, by which prudent device he lured Hannibal to move with his army in some disorder to the city, thinking that things were in a tumult there. Then Marcellus, the nearest gate being, as he had commanded, thrown open, issuing forth with the flower of his horse in front, charged the enemy. By and by the foot, sallying out of another gate, with a proud, loud shout joined in the battle. And while Hannibal opposes part of his forces to these, the third gate also is opened, out of which the rest break forth, and on all quarters fall upon the enemies who were dismayed at this unexpected encounter, and did but feebly resist those with whom they had been first engaged, because of their attack by these others who sallied out later. Here Hannibal's soldiers, with much bloodshed and many wounds, were beaten back to their camp, and for the first time turned their backs to the Romans. There fell in this action, as it is related, more than 5,000 of them. Of the Romans, not above 500. Louis does not affirm that either the victory or the slaughter of the enemy was so great, but certain it is that the adventure brought great glory to Marcellus, and to the Romans after their calamities. A great revival of confidence, as they began now to entertain a hope that the enemy with whom they contended was not invincible, but liable like themselves to defeats. Therefore, the other consul being deceased, the people recalled Marcellus, that they might put him into his place, and, in spite of the magistrates, succeeded in postponing the election till his arrival, when he was by all the suffrages created consul. But because it happened to thunder, the augurs accounting that he was not legitimately created, and yet not daring, for fear of the people, to declare their sentence openly, Marcellus voluntarily resigned the consulate, retaining however his command. Being created proconsul, and returning to the camp at Nola, he proceeded to harass those that followed the party of the Carthaginians, on whose coming with speed to succor them, Marcellus declined a challenge to a set battle, but when Hannibal had sent out a party to plunder, and now expected no fight, he broke out upon with him with his army. He had distributed to the foot long lances, such as are commonly used in naval fights, and instructed them to throw them with great force at convenient distances against the enemies, who were inexperienced in that way of darting, and used to fight with short darts hand to hand. This seems to have been the cause of the total rout and open flight of all the Carthaginians who were then engaged. There fell of them 5,000. 4 elephants were killed and 2 taken. But what was of the greatest moment, on the 3rd day after, more than 300 horse, Spaniards and Numidians mixed, deserted to him, a disaster that had never to that day happened to Hannibal, who had kept together in harmony an army of barbarians, collected out of many various and discordant nations. Marcellus and his successors in all this war made good use of the faithful service of these horsemen. He now was a 3rd time created consul, and sailed over into Sicily. for the success of Hannibal had excited the Carthaginians to lay claim to that whole island, chiefly because, after the murder of the tyrant Hieronymus, all things had been in tumult and confusion at Syracuse. For which reason the Romans also had sent before to that city a force under the conduct of Appius as praetor. While Marcellus was receiving that army, a number of Roman soldiers cast themselves at his feet, upon occasion of the following calamity. Of those that survived the battle at Cannae, some had escaped by flight, and some were taken alive by the enemy, so great a multitude, that it was thought there were not remaining Romans enough to defend the wall of the city. And yet the magnanimity and constancy of the city was such, that it would not redeem the captives from Hannibal, though it might have done so for a small ransom. A decree of the Senate forbade it, and chose rather to leave them to be killed by the enemy, or sold out of Italy, and commanded that all who had saved themselves by flight should be transported into Sicily, and not permitted to return into Italy, until the war with Hannibal should be ended. These, therefore, when Marcellus was arrived in Sicily, addressed themselves to him in great numbers, and casting themselves at his feet, with much lamentation and tears humbly besought him to admit them to honorable service, and promised to make it appear by their future fidelity and exertions that that defeat had been received rather by misfortune than by cowardice. Marcellus, pitying them, petitioned the Senate by letters, that he might have leave at all times to recruit his legions out of them. After much debate about the thing, the Senate decreed they were of opinion that the Commonwealth did not require the service of cowardly soldiers. If Marcellus perhaps thought otherwise, he might make use of them, provided no one of them be honored on any occasion with a crown or a military gift, as a reward of his virtue or courage. This decree stung Marcellus, and on his return to Rome, after the Sicilian war was ended, he upbraided the Senate that they had denied to him, who had so highly deserved of the Republic, the liberty to relieve so great a number of citizens in great calamity. At this time Marcellus, first incensed by injuries done him by Hippocrates, commander of the Syracusans, who, to give proof of his good affection to the Carthaginians, and to acquire the tyranny to himself, had killed a number of Romans at Leontini, besieged and took by force the city of Leontini, yet violated none of the townsmen, only deserters, as many as he took, he subjected to the punishment of the rods and axe. But Hippocrates, sending a report to Syracuse, that Marcellus had put all the adult population to the sword, and then coming upon the Syracusans, who had risen in tumult upon that false report, made himself master of the city. Upon this Marcellus moved with his whole army to Syracuse, and encamping near the wall, sent ambassadors into the city to relate to the Syracusans the truth of what had been done in Leontini. When these could not prevail by treaty, the whole power being now in the hands of Hippocrates, he proceeded to attack the city both by land and by sea. The land forces were conducted by Appius. Marcellus, with 60 galleys, each with 5 rows of oars, furnished with all sorts of arms and missiles, and a huge bridge of planks laid upon 8 ships chained together, upon which was carried the engine to cast stones and darts, assaulted the walls, relying on the abundance and magnificence of his preparations, and on his own previous glory. All which, however, were, it would seem, but trifles for Archimedes and his machines. These machines he had designed and contrived, not as matters of any importance, but as mere amusements in geometry. In compliance with King Hiero's desire and request, some little time before, that he should reduce to practice some part of his admirable speculation in science, and by accommodating the theoretic truth to sensation and ordinary use, bring him more within the appreciation of the people in general. Eudoxus and Archytas had been the first originators of this far-famed and highly prized art of mechanics, which they employed as an elegant illustration of geometrical truths, and as means of sustaining experimentally, to the satisfaction of the senses, conclusions too intricate for proof by words and diagrams. As, for example, to solve the problem, so often required of constructing geometrical figures, given the two extremes, to find the two mean lines of a proportion. Both these mathematicians had recourse to the aid of instruments, adapting to their purpose certain curves and sections of lines. But what with Plato's indignation at it, and his invectives against it as the mere corruption and annihilation of the one good of geometry, which was thus shamefully turning its back upon the unembodied objects of pure intelligence to recur to sensation, and to ask help, not to be obtained without base supervisions and deprivation, from matter. So it was that mechanics came to be separated from geometry, and, repudiated and neglected by philosophers, took its place as a military art. Archimedes, however, in writing to King Hiero, whose friend and near relation he was, had stated that given the force, any given weight might be moved, and even boasted, we are told, relying on the strength of demonstration, that if there were another earth, by going into it he could remove this. Hiero, being struck with amazement at this, and entreating him to make good this problem by actual experiment, and show some great weight moved by a small engine, he fixed accordingly upon a ship of burden out of the king's arsenal, which could not be drawn out of the dock without great labour and many men, and, loading her with many passengers in a full freight, sitting himself the while far off, with no great endeavour, but only holding the head of the pulley in his hand, and drawing the cords by degrees, he drew the ship in a straight line, as smoothly and evenly as if she had been in the sea. The king, astonished at this, and convinced of the power of the art, prevailed upon Archimedes to make him engines accommodated to all the purposes, offensive and defensive, of a siege. These the king himself never made use of, because he spent almost all his life in a profound quiet and the highest affluence. But the apparatus was, in most opportune time, ready at hand for the Syracusans, and with it also the engineer himself. When, therefore, the Romans assaulted the walls in two places at once, fear and consternation stupefied the Syracusans, believing that nothing was able to resist that violence and those forces. But when Archimedes began to ply his engines, he at once shot against the land forces all sorts of missile weapons, and immense masses of stone that came down with incredible noise and violence, against which no man could stand, for they knocked down those upon whom they fell in heaps, breaking all their ranks and files. In the meantime, huge poles thrust out from the walls over the ship sunk some by the great weights which they let down from on high upon them. Others they lifted up into the air by an iron hand or beak like a crane's beak, and, when they had drawn them up by the prow, and set them on end upon the poop, they plunged them to the bottom of the sea, or else the ships, drawn by engines within, and whirled about, were dashed against steep rocks that stood jutting out under the walls, with great destruction of the soldiers that were aboard them. A ship was frequently lifted up to a great height in the air, a dreadful thing to behold, and was rolled to and fro, and kept swinging, until the mariners were all thrown out, when at length it was dashed against the rocks, or let fall. At the engine that Marcellus brought upon the bridge of ships, which was called Sambuca, from some resemblance it had to an instrument of music, while it was yet approaching the wall, there was discharged a piece of rock of 10 talents weight, then a second and a third, which, striking upon it with immense force and a noise like thunder, broke all its foundation to pieces, shook out all its fastenings, and completely dislodged it from the bridge. So Marcellus, doubtful what counsel to pursue, drew off his ships to a safer distance, and sounded a retreat to his forces on land. They then took a resolution of coming up under the walls, if it were possible, in the night, thinking that as Archimedes used ropes stretched at length in playing his engines, the soldiers would now be under the shot, and the darts would, for want of sufficient distance to throw them, fly over their heads without effect. But he, it appeared, had long before framed for such occasions engines accommodated to any distance, and shorter weapons, and had made numerous small openings in the walls, through which, with engines of a shorter range, unexpected blows were inflicted on the assailants. Thus, when they who thought to deceive the defenders came close up to the walls, instantly a shower of darts and other missile weapons was again cast upon them. And when stones came tumbling down perpendicularly upon their heads, and, as it were, the whole wall shot out arrows at them, they retired. And now, again, as they were going off, arrows and darts of a longer range inflicted a great slaughter among them, and their ships were driven one against another, while they themselves were not able to retaliate in any way. For Archimedes had provided and fixed most of his engines immediately under the wall, whence the Romans, seeing that indefinite mischief overwhelmed them from no visible means, began to think they were fighting with the gods. Yet Marcellus escaped unhurt, and deriding his own artificers and engineers, "What," said he, "must we give up fighting with this geometrical Briareus, who plays pitch and toss with our ships, and, with the multitude of darts which he showers at a single moment upon us, really outdoes the 100-handed giants of mythology?" And doubtless, the rest of the Syracusans were but the body of Archimedes' designs, one soul moving and governing all. For, laying aside all other arms, with this alone they infested the Romans and protected themselves. In fine, one such terror had seized upon the Romans that, if they did but see a little rope or a piece of wood from the wall, instantly crying out, that there it was again, Archimedes was about to let fly some engine at them, they turned their backs and fled. Marcellus desisted from conflicts and assaults, putting all his hope in a long siege. Yet Archimedes possessed so high a spirit, so profound a soul, and such treasures of scientific knowledge, that though these inventions had now obtained him the renown of more than human sagacity, he yet would not deign to leave behind him any commentary or writing on such subjects, but repudiating as a sordid and ignoble the whole trade of engineering, and every sort of art that lends itself to mere use and profit, he placed his whole affection and ambition in those purer speculations where there can be no reference to the vulgar needs of life, studies, the superiority of which to all others is unquestioned, and in which the only doubt can be whether the beauty and grandeur of the subjects examined, of the precision and cogency of the methods and means of proof, most deserve our admiration. It is not possible to find in all geometry more difficult and intricate questions, or more simple and lucid explanations. Some ascribe this to his natural genius, while others think that incredible effort and toil produce these, to all appearances, easy and unlabored results. No amount of investigation of yours would succeed in attaining the proof, and yet, once seen, you immediately believe you would have discovered it. By so smooth and so rapid a path he leads you to the conclusion required. And thus it ceases to be incredible that, as is commonly told of him, the charm of his familiar and domestic siren made him forget his food and neglect his person, to that degree that when he was occasionally carried by absolute violence to bathe, or have his body anointed, he used to trace geometrical figures in the ashes of the fire, and diagrams in the oil on his body, being in a state of entire preoccupation, and, in the truest sense, divine possession with his love and delight in science. His discoveries were numerous and admirable, but he is said to have requested his friends and relations that, when he was dead, they would place over his tomb a sphere containing a cylinder, inscribing it with the ratio which the containing solid bears to the contained. Such was Archimedes, who now showed himself, and so far as lay in him the city also, invincible. While the siege continued, Marcellus took Megara, one of the earliest founded of the Greek cities in Sicily, and capturing also the camp of Hippocrates at Aquileia, killed above 8,000 men, having attacked them whilst they were engaged in forming their fortifications. He overran a great part of Sicily, gained over many towns from the Carthaginians, and overcame all that dared to encounter him. As the siege went on, one Damnippus, a Lacedaemonian, putting to sea in a ship from Syracuse, was taken. When the Syracusans must desire to redeem this man, and there were many meetings and treaties about the matter betwixt them and Marcellus, he had opportunity to notice a tower into which a body of men might be secretly introduced, as the wall near to it was not difficult to surmount, and it was itself carelessly guarded. Coming often thither, and entertaining conferences about the release of Damnippus, he had pretty well calculated the height of the tower, and got ladders prepared. The Syracusans celebrated a feast to Diana, this juncture of time, when they were given up entirely to wine and sport, Marcellus laid hold of, and before the citizens perceived it, not only possessed himself of the tower, but, before the break of day, filled the wall around with soldiers, and made his way into the hexapillum. The Syracusans now beginning to stir, and to be alarmed at the tumult, he ordered the trumpets everywhere to sound, and thus frightened them all into a flight, as if all parts of the city were already won, though the most fortified and the fairest, and most ample quarter was still ungained. It is called Aquidina, and was divided by a wall from the outer city, one part of which they called Neapolis, the other Tycha. Possessing himself of these, Marcellus, about break of day, entered through the hexapillum, all his officers congratulating him. But looking down from the higher places upon the beautiful and spacious city below, he is said to have wept much, commiserating the calamity that hung over it, when his thoughts represented to him how dismal and foul the face of the city would be in a few hours, when plundered and sacked by the soldiers. For among the officers of his army there was not one man that durst deny the plunder of the city to the soldiers' demands. Nay, many were instant that it should be set on fire and laid level to the ground, but this Marcellus would not listen to. Yet he granted, but with great unwillingness and reluctance, that the money and slaves should be made prey, giving orders at the same time that none should violate any free person, nor kill, misuse, or make a slave of any of the Syracusans. Though he had used this moderation, he still esteemed the condition of that city to be pitiable, and, even amidst the congratulations and joy, showed his strong feelings of sympathy and commiseration at seeing all the riches accumulated during a long felicity now dissipated in an hour. For it is related that no less prey and plunder was taken here than afterward in Carthage. For not long after they obtained also the plunder of the other parts of the city, which were taken by treachery, leaving nothing untouched but the king's money, which was brought into the public treasury. But nothing afflicted Marcellus so much as the death of Archimedes, who was then, as fate would have it, intent upon working out some problem by a diagram, and having fixed his mind a lag and his eyes upon the subject of his speculation, noticed the incursion of the Romans, nor that the city was taken. In this transport of study and contemplation, a soldier, unexpectedly coming up to him, commanded him to follow to Marcellus, which he declining to do before he had worked out his problem to a demonstration, the soldier, enraged, drew his sword and ran him through. Others write that a Roman soldier, running upon him with a drawn sword, offered to kill him, and that Archimedes, looking back, earnestly besought him to hold his hand a little while, and that he might not leave what he was then at work upon inconclusive and imperfect. But the soldier, nothing moved by his entreaty, instantly killed him. Others again relate that as Archimedes was carrying to Marcellus mathematical instruments, dials, spheres, and angles, by which the magnitude of the sun might be measured to the side, some soldiers seeing him, and thinking that he carried gold in a vessel, slew him. Certain it is that his death was very afflicting to Marcellus, and that Marcellus ever after regarded him that killed him as a murderer, and that he sought for his kindred and honored them with signal favors. Indeed, foreign nations had held the Romans to be excellent soldiers and formidable in battle, but they had hitherto given no memorable example of gentleness or humanity or civil virtue, and Marcellus seems first to have shown to the Greeks that his countrymen were more illustrious for their justice. For such was his moderation to all with whom he had anything to do, and such his benignity also to many cities and private men, that, if anything hard or severe was decreed concerning the people of Enna, Megara, or Syracuse, the blame was thought to belong rather to those upon whom the storm fell, than to those who brought it upon them.